セガサターンシロ。
Hey everyone, and welcome to the SHIRO Editor's Corner, a completely new and unscripted series of mini-casts with your hosts Dave and Peter. Come join your elder SHIROs as we reminisce on our favorite Saturn memories in this new and nostalgia-packed podcast series. Hey everyone, this is Saturn Dave, and I've got Peter here with me. How's it going, Peter?
I'm pretty good as always. How are you, my friend?
I'm still recovering from being sick.
Yeah.
I don't know. I lost my voice at PRGE, and then after that, I got sick, and then it's just been, constant recovery.
Yeah, oh man, I wish you a speedy recovery, my friend, because that does suck for sure.
But anyway, crazy stuff happened in the past couple of weeks. Did you hear about Sacred Pools? Dropping, right?
Yeah, Sacred Pools. So it's always kind of existed in the back of us hardcore Saturn fans' minds, and now a build has come out, and there was a second build that was supposedly a Mac build, but it turned out that it was a Saturn build, and then there was the tie into Rebellion, which I have played before a while ago. So it's super interesting that all of that's come out, and it's neat that as devs talk and as dev kits are found that these bits and pieces of history sort of resurface. I find that to be quite gratifying, really.
Have you had a chance to play it at all?
Not the latest stuff that's come out, to be honest.
Okay.
I did play Rebellion, years and years ago, but right. I'm quite interested in, I've watched, you streamed it, so I watched that.
Okay.
And so I'm quite interested in burning myself a copy and diving into it. So yeah, it'll happen.
It's better than I thought it would be, but it's also not great. I don't know. It exists in this kind of middle area. I can definitely see why they didn't release it, because despite the budget and all the production, which was actually really well done, the programming and the cohesion of the game, as an experience, it can be very frustrating. It can kind of leave you scratching your head, at times. I imagine with a manual, the thing would have been a lot easier,
It's fair.
Which we don't have, at least nobody has come forth with anything like that. But yeah, so trying to figure out which crystals do what, and it's kind of like Zork, where you're just constantly getting lost, and you need a map of this place, which apparently exists, but it's hidden in this game's login computer function or whatever. So anyway, it's pretty wild. But yeah, other than that, I'm just really excited about a recent pickup of official Sega magazines, a huge lot. I'm excited about that. Because I really love official Sega Saturn magazine, and glad to be adding the precursor to that to the collection. Was able to find it in a complete lot, so it made it much more economical, to get it shipped.
That's amazing for a couple of reasons. Number one, I know that shipping from the United Kingdom is not cheap. That's an expensive proposition, and a lot of magazines is going to weigh a ton, right? So, so even just getting it over is not cheap. But just speaking as a fan, I mean, obviously the official Sega Saturn magazine out of Britain is it's my favorite gaming publication from the era, and to know that you're able to sort of dive back into the predecessor of that,
right?
Sort of maintained, a lot of the layout, a lot of the staff, a lot of the sort of ethos behind the magazine. That's pretty cool. So I am just a tiny bit jealous right now. Well done.
Oh, do you not have that one?
I do not. I have the full Sega Saturn magazine set.
Right. Not
invested in the official Sega magazine that came before it.
Yeah, and it covers the early year of Saturn, because it's by the time you opened up issue 1 of OSSM, you're already into what?
Yes.
Christmas of 96? So it's a year passed and a bunch of stuff happened, and you're just okay, what happened? I've read it online, I've read it digital, but it's just not the same, right?
How true.
I can't, I've definitely tried reading magazines in digital format via ebooks or via tablets, and whatnot, but it's just nothing's the same as cracking open a physical magazine and just being able to take it one paragraph at a time, or, put a bookmark in and just pick it up later. It's just different, and then you've got the ritual of reading a games magazine, it's
Mm-hmm.
different, but yeah, so I am very excited about that. Yeah. And again, it's like, it's one of those things where if you see it, you're just like, I have to get this now.
Yep.
If I don't, and I wait on this, somebody else is going to get it.
Yep.
So no regrets there.
Excellent. I know that in the past few weeks, we also did PRGE, and you were out, and so was Ben, and so was Pat. And I just, I know it's been probably talked about on the SHIRO show a lot and what have you. So I just want to know, what's maybe your sort of best takeaway or favorite memory from the show, or anything that really kind of stood out. Why was the experience, special to you?
I mean, the experience was special because I got to meet, some of my best friends. I got to meet and work with Ben and Pat and Kay. And we worked together as a team. Even Adam Korlick was there, and he's a really nice guy. I got to meet him and get to know him a little better. So yeah, like, and Seven Shades, a member of our community, a developer, got to meet and talk to him. So really the people was the best part of PRGE, because yeah, there was a lot of stress, there was a lot of chaos, a lot of things that don't necessarily go to plan that you have to work around, but the people is what makes it worth it, and so yeah, as amazing as the arcade looked, which I didn't really get to partake in or enjoy, and as amazing as many of the other exhibits and the vendor show floor and stuff like that was, I think my biggest takeaway was just, being around those people for close to 3 days and just having fun with them,
Mm-hmm.
and also, spending time talking about and playing Saturn, and helping other people play Saturn was really phenomenal. So yeah.
Oh, amazing. I'll just give a really brief update. I've actually, in terms of Saturn gaming, I've been on a bit of a fighting game renaissance. So
Mm,
I started with Virtua Fighter, played through that, spent a good amount of time with that, and then spent an equally good amount of time with Virtua Fighter Remix. So that was kind of, neat. And then I thought, oh, let's just keep this going. So then I jumped to Fighting Vipers. Really, really enjoyed that. Had a great time with it, and then moved on to Fighters Megamix, which is sort of a silly, goofy, and yet still interesting, fun, and immensely playable game. And I kind of liken it to sort of like a proto Smash Bros. Sort of game.
right.
It that kind of a vibe to it. And so next up on the playlist is Last Bronx. So it's
Wonderful.
been a sort of a neat little sort of journey through the Sega, arcade conversion fighting games that are available on the Saturn. So that's been what's been spinning in my Saturn lately. It's been fun.
That's awesome. What would you say is your favorite out of all of those that you've played so far?
You know, so wow. I mean,
Recent impression only. Like what?
just from this playthrough,
Yeah,
I actually came away most impressed by, believe it or not, Fighting Vipers.
it's a great underrated game, isn't it?
It is, and I think that was the thing. Like, I think back in the day, and I think this will lead nicely into our topic today, but I think back in the day, I was caught up in the Virtua Fighter hype. So there was
Hmm.
several components to that. Number one, there's that sort of myth that in Japan it was just the greatest fighting game ever. It had the largest following, that there were just like, complete masters that would play this game, and you had to learn every, nuance and this and that to really get the most out of the game. So there was that. And then the second sort of bit to that was that Virtua Fighter was always the headliner. It always headlined the latest Sega arcade boards. It always had the latest technology behind it, and so on and so forth. And Fighting Vipers didn't even get as big of a push over here in the West as the Virtua Fighter games did. Virtua Fighter 2 was part of the Christmas 95 Big Three. So it had, the high resolution, 60 frames per second. It got a lot of attention for those reasons. It was also later packed into the 3 free promotion that Sega had. So Virtua Fighter really headlined a lot here too, but Fighting Vipers kind of didn't. And so it almost flew under the radar. And I think that's how I experienced it back in the day. And so to really sit down with it now and play it and enjoy it for what it is, it actually really surprised me. I loved the fact that you can, slowly and methodically sort of bust off your opponent's armor. I love the fact that the moves are kind of a little bit wacky and over the top, and that you can, blow opponents out of the ring and have them break through the barriers and stuff. Like it was fresh and it was fast and it was a lot easier to pick up and play than Virtua Fighter. It had a gentler learning curve, and it just
Right.
had a ton of fun with it. So that was my surprise game for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Fun fact is when I started collecting long boxes again after basically doing it, back in the day. So when I came back into Sega Saturn collecting, that was my first pickup.
Nice.
Was Fighting Vipers, and it was like an Etsy seller that like put it up like a pristine copy
Mm.
for $10. And I was like, I can't not get this,
Mm-hmm,
like
mm-hmm.
that's an excellent deal. It was even back then, when Saturn games were cheaper, but yeah, so it's actually quite a great game, and I love all the characters, and I kind of feel like the art style of it is very much that kind of mid 90s Sega arcade art style that you would get in games like Top Skater.
Yep.
It's got that kind of character to it, which is it's a very specific point in Sega's history, because before that and then after that, it changed quite a bit. But there was just a few games that kind of have that same kind of art style. And Fighting Vipers, I keep wanting to say Virtua. Fighting Vipers is certainly one of them. Yeah. So, and you've got another great one coming up with Last Bronx.
Mm-hmm.
Quite underrated, great fighting game. Last Bronx is my favorite weapons fighter on the Saturn, and is, I feel, kind of like a precursor to like Soul Calibur. I
Mm-hmm.
feel, even though completely unrelated, different teams and everything like that, but I mean, it's like Soul Calibur was the best weapons fighter on the Dreamcast, and Last Bronx was certainly, I feel like, the best weapon fighter on the Saturn.
Yeah, definitely. Yes, I'm definitely looking forward to diving into Last Bronx. And I mean, I guess the one game out of the fighting game 3D Sega conversions that I have not sort of played through this little renaissance I'm going through is Virtua Fighter Kids.
All
I
right.
do have a copy, of course, and I will have to fire it up. But yeah, definitely looking forward to Last Bronx, because I think it's gonna be fun for me. And it's interesting, like I guess these are games that I did play when they were current,
Mm-hmm.
and I think my expectations were maybe misplaced, or maybe I didn't appreciate the depth of these games as much as I am now,
Mm-hmm.
because they're certainly, to me, they are worthy standalone type experiences. Whereas back in the day, it's almost like I was looking for the next sort of gimmick or the next sort of big hit, the next flashy something or other that would come across, and these felt like they weren't offering anything too new. But again, now that I have the time to sort of sit down, relax, and enjoy them, I'm seeing a lot of that stuff, a lot of those layers that I didn't see before.
Well, I tell you what, Peter, you really need to get one of those little USB modems for
Mhm.
like 12. I'll send you a link, but for like $12 and very little setup, you and I could be playing Virtua Fighter Remix online with our
We sure
netlings, and
could.
it's quite a fun experience. They Double Dime in the SHIRO Discord community hosted a Virtua Fighter Remix tournament, and it
Mhm.
was quite a comeback situation with Dan from New York Retrospectors, kind of
Mm.
coming in the wild card, and then he came back to win it. So it was kind of cool. But yeah, so that's awesome. I look forward to hearing more of your takes on Last Bronx when you get through that one.
Absolutely.
But so yeah, so this cast, we're going to be talking about the fifth generation of console gaming and kind of what led up to that and our impressions of that time in gaming history. Like, what was it like to be a fan in the fifth console generation? What did it feel like at that time? And then also just how would we personally characterize each console? Because each one had a very distinct personality. And so, as consumers, as teenagers, how did we view those consoles, and kind of how did we see them characterized? So we should probably start with what kind of led up to the fifth console generation. So maybe we
Mhm.
talk about Sega Nintendo console war.
Yeah, and I'll maybe start us off to how I sort of perceived the sort of changing of the guard, in the console generations from the fourth to the fifth. So, the big players in the fourth generation, towards the tail end of that, were Sega with their Genesis slash Mega Drive, and of course, Nintendo with the Super NES. And there were other systems during that generation too, but by sort of the tail end of that, even things like the Sega CD and the 32X were sort of kind of fading, but the Genesis remained, the Mega Drive Genesis remained, and the Super NES, of course. But there were other sort of players that were starting to come and hit the market because gaming was becoming more and more lucrative, right? So as technology improved, by then, say Super Nintendo and Genesis technology was quite old. Arcades were really pulling ahead, and it was just time for new hardware. And so everybody and their dog, it seems, were throwing their hat in to create a 32-bit or higher console to sort of kick things off. Now, for the longest time, me as a gamer back then, at that point, I would have been, sort of 14, 15, so quite young. It was easy at first to sort of ignore all the new systems for a couple of reasons. Number one, they didn't get too much press coverage in the magazines just yet.
Right.
Not just yet, not at the beginning. And number two, you didn't really find them. They didn't have nearly the retail presence that Nintendo and Sega commanded at the time, right? If you walked into an average toy store, like a Toys R Us or whatever, you'd have a million Sega and Nintendo products there, but you would have very little of the other stuff. You'd have to, I think, as far as I remember, to begin with anyways, if you wanted to experience some of those new up and coming systems, you'd have to go to some pretty specialty and in some cases higher end stores to sort of see them and experience them. So I guess just to begin with, it was easy for me to say, yeah, no, it's still going to be Genesis and Super NES. That's sort of what's out there, and that's what matters at the time. But of course, as time went on, these newer consoles, these newer players started getting more and more attention and traction. And eventually, Sega and Sony themselves announced that they were going to be making 32-bit consoles. And so that sort of mind share, that attention started shifting towards the fifth generation. I'm curious if it was the same experience for you, or was there like a watershed moment where you realized that, okay, there's a new generation of consoles coming, or was it gradual?
It was, so there was that you had this superpower in Nintendo, right? They came in and they pretty much dominated and controlled the market. And when I say controlled the market, I don't mean that as hyperbole. They really controlled retailers. They had everybody by the balls, and they basically made the rules because they had the hot product that sold, and it was like, other players were scared to even try to go up against them, or they would try and they would fail, and Nintendo did a lot of things right. They had some solid business practices that had led to continued success with the NES, but of course, Sega Genesis or the Mega Drive came out in 89, and just off the bat, it was 16 bits. So from a graphic standpoint, it was much better. The performance was better, but that doesn't necessarily matter if the quality of the games aren't there. It had quite a few quality games early off, but the marketing was a little lacking, right? So then of course comes in, Tom Kalinske, say what you will about him, but I mean, he had a brilliant idea to pack in Sonic, which was an excellent game. And what happened was they took over half of the market share, right? So all of a sudden, David fell Goliath, and you had other people looking up and saying, oh my God, they're mortal. Nintendo's not unstoppable. Here, another company did it, right? So I wouldn't say it's like a power vacuum, but I would say that it's a lot like the early United States, where there was like a land rush and everybody was just like, you said, everybody threw their hat in the ring, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like what it was like. You had all these players saying, well, maybe we could too, because now Nintendo does not control the board anymore. So what does that look like to a kid? Well, in 92, I would say I would be reading game magazines, and it was just like you were seeing things like the Sega CD add-on for one. And then you were seeing things like the JVC XI, which was a Sega CD, but it was an all-in-one, right? And you were seeing things like the Turbo Graphics, and you were seeing things like the Neo Geo CD, or at least ads that it was coming, or even the AES itself, So there was a lot. How you're flipping through magazines and you're seeing ads as a kid, right? And some of them connect with you, and then some of them are just like, whoa, there's something crazy that I'll probably never actually see in person.
Hmm.
There was a lot of that, and so as a kid who understood video games as Sega and Nintendo, all of a sudden my eyes were flooded with all of this extra stuff, and that was quite overwhelming. Actually, I remember talking with one of my good friends, who was a little older than me, and he was talking about TurboGrafx, and how it was called PC Engine in Japan and stuff. It just blew my mind that there was other stuff that I just didn't even know about, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess as you get older you find out about these other things, and so that early time period felt very like things were being shaken up, because as a kid I'd always just known two things: Nintendo and Sega. There was nothing else, nothing else even came close to hitting my radar. But all of a sudden my eyes were open to like all of these other things that were coming. And I like to call it like the Wild West of gaming, because there weren't a lot of rules back then, and a lot of things were up in the air. The industry was kind of trying to predict
Yeah.
where everything would fall.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so I love the Wild West sort of analogy because that's exactly how it was. There were no standards at all, really, of any kind. So I'm talking about things like, power supplies to a console, or the video and audio out. I mean, those were typically proprietary connections. So that's one aspect of it. There were other things like, okay, so we were in that strange sort of phase where, was it going to be CD media or was it going to be cartridge media? And, you had a lot of both on the market. There was things like, a lot of consoles still only just had one control port. Some had two, and then there was talk of, potentially some up and coming consoles with more than two. And, that ended up being Nintendo 64. So yeah, there were no sort of standards at all. And so, yeah, absolutely it was Wild West. The other thing that I would, I guess, add to that is, teams that made games back then were really, really small.
True.
I
Yeah.
mean, there were less than 10 people that made the first Sonic the Hedgehog, less
Mhm.
than 10. And so I think the side effect of that is it just really strengthened that sentiment that anybody could throw their hat in the ring. And if you just strike it right, if lightning strikes, you're going to hit it big and
Mhm.
you're going to be the next big thing. And so, if you think about the last few generations of gaming, it's always been the PlayStation, whatever the next Xbox is, and then Nintendo. And that's pretty well it.
Mhm.
If you stay away from the PC side of things. But back then, I mean, there were all kinds of players that were trying it out. And, at the very beginning of that generation, we had things like the 3DO, the Atari Jaguar. We had things like the Pippin console.
Right.
There was
Good call.
and there was the successor to the PC Engine, and the name escapes me now.
Or are we talking about the Duo with the CDs? Because that was
Mm-mm.
another thing, is like everybody threw their hat in the ring with CD add-ons. Even
Yes, that
Atari
was
Jaguar had a CD add-on. There was the Turbo CD, or the PC Engine, CD, the Duo.
yeah,
The Wonder Mega, which was another all-in-one. You'd see it
yeah.
in magazines, but it would be like this crazy alien thing that you knew you'd probably never see in your lifetime. Or, and like I said, the XI. Sega CD.
The
Everybody wanted to
Jaguar
like do a
CD,
CD
right?
add-on. Nintendo was working on one. You'd hear
Yeah.
about, read articles. Nintendo was going to have a CD add-on. So it's like lots of noise, lots of clutter.
Mhm.
And again, that proved to be kind of dangerous for some, like the add-on space
Yeah.
was just a gamble, because it was like, if you could introduce an add-on, but if you didn't support it, then you had a huge, money pit, or you had
And
a
a PR
huge,
problem, really.
exactly, and a PR problem, yeah, and breaking customer loyalty.
So there were a ton of different players,
Yes.
and so yes, so I remember distinctly, especially around the holiday time, often hitting shopping malls because they were just the thing back then, right?
Hmm.
So you'd go to the mall, and if you went to any of the larger sort of big box stores that typically anchored those malls, in their video game section, you would find your Genesis and Super NES and that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. But that would be more or less it. There'd be a lot of it, and they'd typically be carrying a lot of titles for these two machines. They would really not be carrying the Neo Geo, for example. Like they were going to carry what was going to sell. But then you went to
Right.
some of the smaller stores in the mall, and I'm talking about places like the Radio Shacks. and they would have all this extra stuff. Now, so you'd be walking into Radio Shack, and it's certainly more of a higher end electronics store than your typical big box department store was. Obviously, it was a smaller space, and the staff that were working it were typically a lot more knowledgeable than somebody working at the Walmart or whatever. Obviously,
Right.
and these stores, at least in my experience, typically had several demo units that were available that you could try and test out before you dropped money on a machine. And that's where I remember seeing for the very first time, for example, a game like Road Rash running on the 3DO.
Mm.
And this was before Saturn, this was before PlayStation. And I remember just being really impressed, thinking, okay, now I'm starting to see and understand more than you would by looking at still screenshots in a magazine about how 3D is going to really kind of be the future and take over. And
Hmm.
there's one other component that sort of did it for me, Dave, and that is that back in those days, the arcade scene was still really strong. So if you wanted to see the future of gaming, because there was a massive, gap between what a home console could do versus what the latest cutting edge arcade
Oh
machine
yeah,
could do. There was just,
absolutely.
today there would be no difference, but back then, you were 2 or 3 or 4 generations ahead if you wanted to step into the arcade. And I remember seeing Daytona USA running for the very first time on an,
Oh
an
my
arcade
goodness.
cabinet, and seeing fluid 60 frame per second 3D graphics coming at you, and as you're driving and everything. And that just blew me away. Virtua Fighter, yes, that demonstrated to me, look, it's a fighting game, it's a 2-on-2 fighting game, kind of like Street
Right.
Fighter, kind of like Mortal Kombat, but it's
Hmm.
in a 3D space. But the game, like the experience of the game, didn't feel too different.
Right.
Whereas seeing Daytona USA in the arcades, it was like, okay, wow, this is a whole new dimension of gaming, right?
It was a quantum leap.
It was,
Yeah,
absolutely.
see, because in '92, I want to say I loved Star Fox on the Super
Mhm.
Nintendo, right? Played that game to death, beat it a million times, right? And my young mind was just floored by the idea of like, this is the future. These floating polygons, and gameplay going into the third dimension. It blew my mind. Even though it was like 12 frames per
Mhm.
second, I didn't care. I wasn't even aware of frame rates back then, honestly. Like that was not that's something that subsequently, we're nerds and we know all about this stuff. But back then, it was like if the game ran a little slow, I just felt like my console must be working really hard.
Yeah.
It just didn't register with me, but it just blew my mind. And so when I saw stuff like Virtua Racing or Virtua Fighter in the arcade, I thought, okay, this is much better. That these kind of experiences are moving into the arcade and they're doing it better and they're doing it faster. But yeah, when you saw Daytona with the textures and the frame rate, and you didn't know what a frame rate was as a kid, but you knew that it looked amazing, like fluid motion,
Yeah.
and it was just absolutely mind-boggling. Yeah, it was definitely like a quantum leap. It's amazing to see how much progress they made in such a short
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
Those developers, and then the fact that that original cabinet Daytona USA has stuck around, in
Oh,
arcades,
huge.
like to this day, like it's aged very well,
Mhm.
you know. And I mean, like you said, it can't be understated how important the arcade was as a means of like kind of setting the tone for what was to come, because nowadays really all you have are like ticket centers,
Yep.
like Chuck E. Cheese and stuff. Like that's not an arcade.
Yep.
I mean, they have Plants versus Zombies in there
Yes.
and stuff
Yeah.
like that. It's not, they have phone games, it's not the same, but back then the arcade was just the tops, like you said. And I mean, Sega was at the top of that. No contest, no question. I mean, Namco was great. They were a good second, but Sega, they owned the arcade. They made the best games,
Yes.
And so, yeah, you did kind of look at the arcade and say, well, it'd be great if we could bring that home. But that brings up a very good point, because as the fifth generation was on the horizon, as the fifth console generation was looming on the horizon, not only was there a lot of changes going on with the hardware, but there was also a lot of change going on with what were video games, like what were they
Yeah.
supposed to be. Some people thought that FMV was the future of video games, and they really put all their eggs in that basket. Some people thought that it was 3D polygons, and they were going to go real heavy on that. And then some felt like it was more like interactive media, you know? I mean, there was a lot more clutter than we even mentioned. There was the CDI, you know,
Yep.
Philips CDI. And I do remember walking into a Sears electronics department, probably 90. So this is where my brain gets fuzzy. I don't know if it was 91 or 92, but I saw the CDI. And as funny as this might sound, it looked impressive
Hmm.
back then. You know, I saw like Max Magician, I think it was, and it's like this interactive game where you click on stuff and he talks to you. And honestly, as a kid, I was really impressed. I was like, okay, well, this is not Star Fox, but this is definitely something
Hmm.
different, you know?
Hmm.
And so, yeah, that's just one more, you know, interactive media player was a huge thing back then. Everybody wanted to get in on that kind of set top box interactive media player space, you know, because they were trying to get adults in on video games. You know, they were trying to destigmatize video games as like this thing that was just for kids. You know, adults can get in on gaming too. And what does that look like? What does that mean? So yeah, there was a lot of different takes, I guess, a lot of disagreement on what video games should be. And so that's another reason why it was kind of the Wild West, because nowadays we have much clearer genre standards, you know, but back then it was just, you know, people were just trying
Yep.
everything.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I recall specifically like FMV. So obviously there were a ton of FMV games on, consoles like the Sega CD and the 3DO. Eventually, Saturn got them. PlayStation got them at the beginning there. But there were also these sort of games that's used FMV heavily just for cutscenes or for story exposition. So I'm thinking of games like Total Eclipse, or games like The Horde, you know what I mean? Where the actual gameplay, were graphics, but in between you would have story exposition that was done through FMV. And, back then it was just so cutting edge because that's not something that the Genesis could pull off. Super Nintendo couldn't do that. This takes memory. There's no way this would fit on a cartridge, and oh my goodness, it's so cool. And looking back, of course, a lot of it is cheese, and perhaps charming cheese in a way, but back then, like you said, everybody was trying all these different things. Another segment that I thought was really sort of prevalent at the beginning of the generation, and kind of maybe petered out a little bit as the Saturn and PlayStation gained steam, were PC ports. So a lot of PC ports made their way over to the consoles. I'm talking about games like Myst or SimCity, or there were a horde of others. But games that Magic Carpet is another one. So
Mostly because of the CD, like
yeah,
the
precisely, right.
advent of CD in gaming and stuff like that, because now these consoles had CD drives. They
That's
could
right.
fit all the data, you know, arguably not very compressed.
Highly well, and okay, so gaming on a PC back then was an exceptionally different experience from gaming on the console. Like the PC would give you, higher resolution, more colors, and all the rest of it, but it wouldn't necessarily give you the smooth sprite movements or whatever that a console would. And you'd be constrained to sitting at a desk when you're playing on your PC versus sitting on a
Right.
couch and all that. So it was quite a different experience. And so I felt that as the 32-bit generation sort of got on, there was a lot of crossover where a lot of
Mhm.
PC games tried to make it over to the consoles. And that obviously didn't last too long, because by the end of the generation that just really wasn't happening in this to the same degree. But yeah, that was another sort of memory, I think, of how the generation rolled out.
I mean, kids rule the living room, right? You know, we
Hmm.
get control of the TV for cartoons and whatever. You know, so it's like the kids rule the living room and the adults rule the computer. You know, because the computer is for business, right? At least that's what it
Right.
was. You doing the taxes and doing the spreadsheets and Word docs and stuff like that. And so it was like games for the PC were targeted mostly towards adults,
Yeah.
because they were like, okay, figure they're already working on the computer, they can waste time on this game on, Mist, trying to
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
stuck
Yeah.
on Mist and everything, and then like go back to doing their taxes or whatever. Whereas with the living room, that's where the kids are mostly. I mean, at least that's the way that it was in my house in the 90s, you know?
Yep.
It's like we come home from school and it was like Ninja Turtles and Darkwing Duck and SNES, you know, or Genesis, you know.
Yep.
It was just an extension, really. And you had companies like Virgin Interactive trying to basically crystallize the Disney animation experience into a game, you know, that it
Mm-hmm.
really did feel like an interactive version of watching the movie Aladdin, you know, but you were playing it with a character, and they spent a lot of time on like rotoscoping and stuff. And so, yeah, it was like they were doing the rotoscoping, hand drawing animation and stuff like that. And you had Nintendo of America focusing really heavily on pre-rendered 3D
Yeah.
graphics, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
capturing that, which, you know, Midway did to an extent with, you know, Mortal Kombat doing the not pre-rendered, but I guess those were just like
Digitized, right?
digitized. Exactly. And then with this, it was like, oh, you know, with games like Killer Instinct or Donkey Kong Country, it was, again, very visually stunning, you know, but it was basically faking 3D, you know,
Yeah.
by pre-rendering it on their side and then just turning that into sprites, you know. But yeah, so the look of games was so varied back then. I mean,
Huge.
if you just have like a bin full of games from that time period, you're going to get just a wild assortment of
Mm-hmm.
content, you know, and a wild assortment of different looking things because there just wasn't that much in the way of standards,
Oh,
you
for
know.
sure.
Some of those things were really impactful, like the fact that Nintendo decided to stick with a cart, you know, for the Nintendo 64. That was kind of, you know, a very controversial decision. And it led to, you know, companies like Square, which they had a long standing relationship with, moving over to a platform that supported CDs, you know, because they were like, whoa, FMV is really, really hot right now. We want to be able to tell our stories with full cinematics, you know? And it's funny how like that has become much and much less important nowadays. I mean, especially once the Dreamcast hit and you could just tell stories in the in-graphics engine,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah.
like, you know, when graphics got good enough to be able to just tell the story without leaving the engine, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
it mattered a lot less. But yeah, back then FMV really was, you couldn't underestimate how important it was. It was like, if your game doesn't have an FMV intro sequence, then
Oh,
it's not.
jeez.
You
How
know?
true.
I'm a reviewer. I'm going to
Yes.
give it a demerit, you
Yes.
know, because it doesn't have an FMV opening
Yeah.
sequence,
Oh,
you know?
absolutely. Absolutely. And so, yeah, like, I mean, one other thing that you mentioned earlier that in retrospect really makes a lot of sense to me is you're right. During the Genesis Super NES era, games were largely seen as a child's toy. Like they weren't really a pastime that adults got into all that often, and games certainly weren't targeted at them. But I felt that changed in the 32-bit generation.
Well, and Nintendo was instrumental in that too, though,
Hmm.
because when you go back to the 80s, the arcade was really popular in the 80s as well. You know, had the arcade boom, and lots of adults played arcade games. You know, older teens and adults played arcade games. And I would even argue that older, I don't know, young adults, I would say, young adults to, you know, middle-aged adults might have, you know, picked up an Atari or a ColecoVision or something like that, you know, and played it as well as, you know, introduced their kids to it. You know, my dad
Mm,
had an Atari 2600. It was something that he picked up in his mid 20s, right?
yeah.
But then the crash happened, you know, and quite quickly, at least in America, and of course, we're speaking, it's completely different in Japan. Okay, like in Japan, it's like an alternate timeline, alternate universe. But at least in America, in the West, you know, there was such a negative stigma on video games, you know, because you know, newscasts were brutal, you know, like the evening news were like, video games, you know, they're a waste of time and money, and you
Oh
know, they're
God.
gonna, you know, ruin your kids' grades or whatever, you know. So, you know, there was just this really negative stigma towards video games, and then once
Yep.
the crash happened, Nintendo had to bring it back as a toy. That's what they had to do to slip it into the market, you know, is position it as a kid's toy, and that it was an
Hmm.
interactive toy, and it came with the Robbie the robot, and it came with the gun and everything, and it was a toy. So they pushed that so hard so that they could get it in, you know. That was part of their ability to reintroduce video games to the market, was to push them as a toy. So that messaging, subconscious or otherwise, really worked. And so for the longest time, everybody just thought of video games as a toy. And if you were an adult playing video games, you must live with your mother in the basement or something like
Definitely
that,
not the norm. Yep, absolutely.
No offense to people who live with their mother in the basement, but I mean, definitely like there was just this really negative stigma towards it. And of course, the truth is that adults like video games too, as the industry would discover, during the fifth console generation, when they started trying to make more mature content, because the industry discovered where the money was coming from and where it was going. And that this was not just a $1 million industry, but potentially $1 billion industry.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and so it's funny because the video game landscape at the beginning of that generation was so different to what it looked like at the end of the generation. Like, um, I,
Absolutely.
I guess one other aspect that now comes to mind is there were a ton of fairly small software houses and publishing outfits,
Hmm.
you know,
Hmm.
and it was really during that generation that we saw the beginnings of, the industry cannibalizing itself and sort of cementing a smaller number of larger software houses.
Hmm.
But there was, yeah, definitely a ton of software houses, third parties that wanted to publish all over the place, that were available at the time, and so I'm sure that helped sort of that huge variety that we saw, that smorgasbord of all kinds of software.
Hmm.
And then you still, for a long while into the 32-bit generation, you had the Super NES and Genesis still pumping out some of their best titles at the time.
Right.
Like, I'm
Yeah.
talking about games like, Super Mario RPG, that came out long after the 32-bit generation,
Hmm.
started. Or games like Vector Man on the Genesis, a really cool little run and gun game that had amazing animation and all the rest of it. That came out after Saturn. So, there was that bit of an overlap, I guess. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, so it was a very, very interesting time. Oh, and one other thing that I remember, and I'm not sure that this is as prominent as it was back then anymore, but when you went to buy a console, one of the aspects on the box was that it listed all of the console specs, like as if a kid buying a console
Right.
would
Yes.
understand the difference between a 28.8 megahertz processor versus a 33 megahertz processor. Like,
Absolutely.
you know what I mean? But it was on there
More
because
bits.
it was it's just something that you did. And so it's almost like the industry was in the process of sort of forging its identity in a way,
Hmm.
you know what I
Hmm.
mean? So
Yeah.
lots of stuff was getting thrown at the wall, and then people were just seeing what stuck, and kind of, as the generation went on, they were kind of focusing and narrowing more on, on that kind of stuff.
I
So
mean, Nintendo didn't bother, touting the fact that the NES was an 8-bit console. It was just like computers were 8-bit back then,
yeah.
You had games that would run on an 8-bit computer, like a traditional like 8-bit computer that either
Mhm.
ran cassettes or cartridges, on a monitor. And a lot of those would get ported to the NES. The NES was just an 8-bit computer, that used your television
Yep.
to draw the images and stuff. But the funny thing is that when the Genesis came, when the Mega Drive came, that was part of the marketing. This is 16-bit. It's double the bits, like, and
That's
so
right.
that really is what started the idea in consumers' minds that, wow, more bits is better,
Is better. Yeah.
and then it's like double that, 32-bit, 64-bit, and consumers didn't know what the hell that meant, what I'm saying? So they
Hmm.
they really would eat up marketing like Ataris, like do the math, this plus this equals 64-bit. No, sorry, that's not how it works at all, but it's funny. Yeah. Like they finally like got over that. I think in the sixth console generation, they're just like, okay, these are like 128-bit. Like we're going to stop counting. But I mean, there was one thing I wanted to say, and that was, as I'm talking to you, and we're talking about this, I'm starting to think about like all of the ways that gaming changed, and you mentioned that you had games that were developed by teams of 5 to 10 people, right?
Hmm.
Well, if you go back far enough, you had teams of one person, arcade games that were coded by one person, right? That was very common. You had games that were maybe made by two people, right? Working together. And that wasn't uncommon even in the Saturn generation. You would still have ports being done by one person or two people, right?
Mhm.
We've heard about that kind of thing with like NBA Jam, they're like, here's the assets, take care of it.
Yep. Yep.
You had companies like Connecticut Leather Company knowing absolutely nothing about video games, but being like, this is a hot new thing. We need to get in on video games, right? Of course, they know nothing about programming. They know nothing about video games. They know business, right? And they know how to throw money at something, right? So there was much less oversight in terms of telling companies how to make games. They were just like,
Mhm.
we just need software, You had companies like 3DO. I'm jumping around on the timeline, but the point is you had companies like 3DO saying, we have this great new platform. We really want it to do well. We need software. Give us software. Doesn't matter what it is. You have an idea, we'll make a game, $3 to publish. Sounds like a deal, right? So
Yeah.
so you basically had just an open door. And if you knew enough about how to make a game, you could get in. And so the industry has changed so much because back then there was just so much less oversight. And we know this as being a podcast, right? Which our leadership consists of 5 people, right? How hard it is to make a unanimous decision, with even 5 people, you have to make sure everybody's on board, right? And as you grow, you lose creative control and there's more oversight and you have to worry about pleasing everyone, right? So you had these teams where early on they were able to get very creative, take a lot of risks, and make the game that they wanted to make. And then as the 5th console generation came, you had games that were, developed by teams of anywhere from between 5 people, moving on to the end of the generation to like 50 people, right? PlayStation made developing easier,
Mhm.
blew up the size of development houses and the expectation for what a blockbuster game should be. So you had teams of 50 people, then you had teams of like 100 people. Move on into the PlayStation 2 era, or even into the PlayStation 3 era.
Mhm.
Development houses, publishing companies have blown up to massive proportions. We're talking about Hollywood proportions. And of course, the industry is worth more than Hollywood. Anyway, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry and there is so much oversight. And I can say that having worked for a short stint at Sony Computer Entertainment, that there are so many forms, there is so much red tape. The kind of cowboy stories you hear about, like Kenji Eno getting on a plane and flying his own copy of the game that had like extra adult content on it or something like that and slipping that into the hands of the production factory. That just doesn't happen. And if it does, I mean, it's like,
Not going to happen these days.
you get fired, you know what I'm saying? Or you like break some kind of NDA and you get sued for millions, I mean, there's just so much oversight
Huge.
in the game industry nowadays and so much control from these greater companies that now know video games. They know the industry, they know the product, and they know what they want and what they'll allow. And so they're not just saying, oh, here's a blank check. You guys know video games. You make it. That's
Have at it. Yeah.
so. I mean,
Yeah.
that's had, believe it or not, a profound effect on what kind of video games we get these days.
Oh, definitely. And, just to sort of add on to that, aside from my Nintendo Switch, I don't play modern games on any other sort of format. And that is one of the primary reasons, is that gaming has become over commercialized for me. And that really, like, we saw the seeds of that during the 5th generation of consoles. Because remember at the time too, like the video game rating system was fresh. It was really, really fresh, whereas now you can't release something without having, I mean, I guess you can, but you don't want to release something without having, a rating for it, because, retailers won't carry it potentially, or you'll alienate your market or whatever. So, like you said, a lot of cowboy type stuff going on, a lot of Wild West of gaming. And yes, we did get a lot of crap, along with all the sort of greats that came out of that generation. But to me, it was a very, very like, we're art dominated versus necessarily the business side of it. Like the industry was still figuring out the business side of it and what they should focus on and everything. And there was, a million different players in the industry. And so a lot of it was very sort of creative, very art focused. And that made that entire generation quite enjoyable for me. And, as I sort of think back, even some of the smaller players from the generation had some pretty amazing titles. Like if I look at the Jaguar, which I do not own one, but it had an amazing version of Alien versus Predator. It had possibly the best version of Tempest 2000. It had a really good version of, Rayman, and so on and so forth. So even these small guys had some really amazing titles to them. So, you know, unless you were really, really sold on either Sonic or Mario, you would be, I would argue, you would be relatively happy with whatever console you picked up. Unless it was something like a CDI or maybe an Apple Pippin or whatever it was. Like, even some of the sort of middle tier players had some really impressive software to it. And so, it was difficult to go wrong. But that said, most consoles of the era, definitely for the earlier part of the generation, were expensive, like very, very expensive. I mean, the 3DO was coming up to $1,000, and that was back in mid '90s dollars. I couldn't tell you what the price point of the Jaguar was. I just don't remember. But that's one thing that the outgoing Genesis and Super NES had over all these machines is they were sub $100 at that point. They were $99.99 in retail, and so that really drove some of their sort of late sales. So yeah, it was just a lot of sort of let's throw things at the wall and see what sticks. But there was some really, really cool art type stuff that came out of that, and that gives me a real fondness for that particular generation.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how do you feel about that? Like the fact that it was kind of such a sort of smorgasbord of all kinds of stuff.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's without a doubt, it's my favorite console generation. And, I'm not a completely, blind fanboy to say that the games were the best in that console generation. Like, I definitely think that a lot of the gaming experiences continue to be refined in like the Dreamcast PS2 era. I really feel like once they hit that era, they really were able to nail down the gaming as an art form, telling stories, having these massive worlds. The technology had caught up to the vision.
Sure.
In other words, they still struggled with that in the fifth console generation. And so you had really creative development studios like Team Andromeda, who were famous for, working around limitations.
Right.
And oftentimes that breeds really special gaming experiences. When you have a set of limitations and you really have to work around that, it often forces developers to find really creative solutions, and that ends up giving the game a certain visual personality. And I think that that's true with the Panzer Dragoon series. They are the way they are because of the kind of challenges and obstacles that Andromeda had to deal with the Saturn hardware. And they did a phenomenal job with it. And of course, I personally, subjectively love a lot of the games in the fifth console generation, but I'm not going to just say objectively that they're the best games. I just personally love that generation because of what you said, like so much variety, so much risk taking, so much possibility, I guess, because at that point, anything really was possible or seemed possible, And you were right that the arcade really was informing the at-home experiences, save like FMV, the folks that really wanted to push film as a game, basically interactive movies and stuff like that. That was something you really didn't get in the arcade. But you did get ride-on arcade systems like the Jurassic Park stuff where there was like, FMV or something like that. You'd get that to a degree in the arcade, but it was really much more prominent at home. Whereas the arcades were looking towards the future of gaming in terms of like VR. They always really wanted to push VR. There were all these different attempts at trying to create a working virtual reality system, whether it was something that you stand up and put your eyes in, or whether it was one of those virtuality helmets or whatever. And so that always translated to the home market where, like Nintendo was like, this is big. They're trying to do it in the arcades. We need to find a way to do it at home. And Nintendo had been trying for a while, actually. And they finally released the Virtual Boy, which also came at the dawn of the fifth generation. It was on the market at that same kind of on the tail end of the fourth console generation, but it was there in that weird no man's land, transition period, like you were saying, like Vector Man and stuff. You had the Virtual Boy. And it was just like, kids didn't really have that much disposable income. They were mostly having to ask their parents, Can you get this
Yep.
for me? Right. And then the parents were fighting both negative stigma of video games, because you're hearing all this stuff on the news about how the games are going to rot my kid's brain or they're going to make them violent,
Yeah.
but they're like, oh, but they really enjoy these video games. How much do I shell out for this? Oh, they want a completely new platform. Okay. Or, whether it's the 32X, and that to a parent seems much more economical because you're like, well, I already bought them a Genesis and this is an add-on for that. So, I mean, at least we're staying within that platform versus shelling out for a completely new platform and then having to get games for it. Virtual Boy was a really cool idea, and I was blown away at Toys R Us, being able to like try it out. But at the same time, it really did give me a headache, and it was just like red graphics. And as a kid, you're just like that doesn't make sense to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
you don't
Yeah.
understand like the technical limitations. You just feel like that's kind of stupid. Why is it just
Yep.
red, But
Yep.
yeah, so it's hard to describe. All I can say that there was just a lot of noise, because you had so many different gaming devices. We're not even talking about the handheld space, which included
Hmm. Hmm.
the Game Boy. And then Sega answered back with the Game Gear. And then, of course, you also had outliers like the Turbo Express or whatever, or you had the
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 Atari
Atari
Lynx.
Lynx, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I mean, if you were a kid just watching afternoon television, you were just getting bombarded with commercials telling you that you weren't cool if you didn't have a Sega CD,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
or that you needed to get in on the 32-bit revolution with a 32X add-on, and then just all this other stuff in gaming magazines. There was so much to beg your parents for for Christmas, that it just ended up being kind of fatiguing.
Yeah. That's true, I guess. Yeah.
So what did you focus on? You kind of maybe waited to see where the dust settled a little bit, or you were older and you had more disposable income and you were able to make risky purchases. Those few people that were able to buy an AES or maybe buy a 3DO when it launched, they were pretty daring individuals, because if you look at how much that thing costs adjusted for inflation, it's ridiculous.
Oh, no question. Yeah.
Can you imagine the leap of faith that you have to take? But then again, Time Magazine said it was like the product of the year. So a lot of people, they really hyped it up.
Well, and see, I think that's another reason why we had the variety and it wasn't quashed as quickly, and that being the absence of the internet. So if I'm trying to decide, should I buy a Saturn or a 3DO or a Jaguar? I'm just going to look it up on the internet and see what the reviews are and, see what people's thoughts are on these machines, whatever. But you couldn't do that back then. There was no internet. So, what you had to rely on were, magazines, which were primarily written, not from an industry perspective, but more from a, fan review type perspective, and not much else. I mean, that's kind of what you had to go by. So if a magazine said, as an example, oh, the PlayStation is the best system ever, well, then who are you to argue that? You know what I mean? So unless you were really hardcore into video games, and I mean hardcore by, like understanding the business behind it, the companies that made the games, the logistics behind how retail works and whatever, unless you were that deep in, there was very little information that you could get yourself as a single individual consumer that would help sort of color your choice. So, things like kiosks and booths and whatever inside stores like Radio Shack and whatever, they were very sort of informative and telling. And so as the generation went on, like I remember going in and trying out Road Rash on 3DO and being absolutely impressed. I remember seeing kiosks running Panzer Dragoon when the Saturn was just around the corner. And I thought, wow, this is the future. Like, there's no way this was going to get beat. But that tended to, I find, work against Sega in a lot of ways as soon as Sony kind of showed up. Because when you side-by-side compared games like Virtua Fighter to Toshinden, or games like Daytona USA to Ridge Racer, it looked a lot better on Sony's machine. Like, it really did. And for a young kid who didn't, understand that maybe, hey, like it could be that the gameplay is fantastic, or that it was not really possible to bring over a cutting edge arcade game into a relatively modest system, in comparison, that this is actually, as good as it's going to get for a while. Like those connections, I don't know that they were there to be made just yet. You know what I mean? So
Right, right.
yeah, like a lot of folks may have felt after they purchased a 3DO and then a few years later it fizzled out, they may have felt quite burned by the experience,
Oh, of course.
as opposed to like, okay, wow, for 2 years before anybody else could, I was experiencing, 3D gaming and this and that. So,
Right.
because it was expensive, like it was a lot of money. So, you typically could only just buy one system, and then you were really rooting hard for that system to be the one that kind of went the distance. So,
For folks that, money was less of an issue, or they could easily afford it, I think that they have fond memories of being on that cutting edge, and being able to experience like a new horizon of games for a couple years. Yeah.
yeah.
And then of course the folks that took a chance on it at a great expense, and then failed to see the support, or, saw the machine quickly eclipsed by other machines, probably have less positive things to
Sure.
remember or to say about it.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I'm not mentioning specific dates, but I have a rough timeline of this generation, and it all, I believe the 32X came first, if even by a hair. It was like 32X was released, and around the same time you had the Atari Jaguar. The Atari Jaguar was released around the same time, and was, like you said, it was $200, I think, and then it was dropped to 150, shortly after, because it wasn't really doing that well.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, again, it was, saying forget 32-bit, we've got 64-bit, and there was a lot of fake news. I guess you could call it fake news, and not a lot of fact checking. Like you didn't have, like you said, the internet to tell kids, that's just a bunch of hooey, I
Yes.
guess, and then of course, right on its heels was Panasonic's 3DO. Well, the 3DO standard was released by other, Sanyo and Gold Star, of course, which became LG. Yeah. But the first one was Panasonic. And this is, I'm thinking mostly in terms of their releases in the West. I'm not exactly sure when it comes to Japan, when they were released, but yeah, those three were really kind of clustered
Yeah.
around the same time. 32X as an add-on to the Genesis,
Yep.
kind of eke out
Yep.
more life. Because again, you have to remember, Genesis came out in '89, a couple years before even the SNES came out, and then it had to do battle with SNES head on. SNES versus Genesis. SNES kind of eked ahead with stuff like the Super FX chip. SNES started pushing 3D graphics without the use of an add-on, just
Yep.
kind of putting a chip onto a cart. Of course, I have to say those Star Fox carts were like $80. It wasn't cheap. Maybe even 100. I don't remember, but I do remember seeing like Target ads where it was at least $80 for a Star Fox cart because of that chip that was on there. And of course, you had like Doom with the FX2 chip. You had Stunt Race FX. You had, I think, like some kind of a dirt bike game on the Super Nintendo. You had Killer Instinct. Nintendo loved to also just use a lot of different support chips. Some of them wouldn't be as highly marketed as like the FX chip. The FX chip was just really easy to market, because it's just got a flashy name and stuff like that. But yeah, Nintendo was still using support chips for a lot of their games, like Yoshi's Island and stuff like that. So, but anyway, so they were kind of extending their console's life through the use of either helper chips like that, or just graphics effects, like building games like Donkey Kong Country out of pre-rendered 3D graphics. So that's how they were kind of like trying to push the plane down the runway and get it down there to our I don't know, whatever kind of metaphor you want. But essentially, they were just trying to buy themselves time until they could get to the next generation, which was what they were working on in secret, Ultra 64 or whatever.
It's funny that you mention all of that, because I guess ads were very, very sort of distinct in that generation, weren't they?
Yeah.
Like a lot of print ads in magazines, of course. You had your TV spots, and again, very memorable. Like when you were talking about, the Jaguar and do the math, the 64-bit.
Oh, yeah.
I to this day have this print ad, etched in my brain of like this skinny little tree branch and an elephant behind it. And I'm sure everybody listening will remember this ad. And it's like, are you smart enough to spot the elephant? Then you should be smart enough to know that 64 is better than 32. And like, so very distinct and memorable ads, definitely.
So the 90s were all about attitude, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
90s were all about, it's like Sonic didn't have time to sit there while you went and got a drink of water or something like that. So he would tap his foot and you'd be like, what's going on? Get back on the controls, right? It became quite a thing to insult the gamer's intelligence,
Yeah.
And then as a gamer, it was like, what were you going to say to that? You didn't want to be, thought of as an idiot, or
Mm-hmm.
as
Mm-hmm.
uncool, so it was like, when they would basically say, if you don't understand this, then you're stupid. Like that's a really interesting way to sell stuff. But then again, that is what we had, early on like that. You also had ads like the little kid saying, "Mommy, what are those two
Oh,
consoles
yes.
doing?" And it was like obviously sexual innuendo,
Yeah.
but again, it's like the ad is basically saying, are you clever enough to get what we're saying here? Well, if you are, then maybe you should be playing this system, because you're cool, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Your brain is in the gutter, just like ours. And it continued with like the naked lady ad for the Saturn.
Yes. Yes.
You don't even notice the naked lady in the middle of the ad because there's so many great games, right?
Yes. Exactly.
Or I don't know, Neo Geo, they had their share of the AES was the big dog. Are you a big dog? Or are you like one of those little wimpy dogs? And again, like Sega always trying to castrate Nintendo and say like, if you have our system, the comparison was either like a Top Fuel dragster
Oh,
or
yes.
a little
Yeah.
ice cream truck with the Super Mario Kart.
Yeah. 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 Well, and to their credit, Sony was really effective when they started playing the Crash Bandicoot ads,
Yes.
where the guy in the suit would go over and, with his little megaphone and
Hey, Nintendo mustache man.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
And so yes, credit to them. They did do a really edgy campaign that obviously worked for the time period.
It was literally mudslinging from all around.
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, it was like when Donkey Kong Country was coming out. It was all like, "This is not on 32-bit add-ons. This is not on Sega CD," and blah blah blah. Like it was. You're absolutely right. Rather than highlighting the product, it was more, you're stupid if you don't get this.
right. They're like sitting in the boardroom and they're like, either we're going to insult our competition or we're going to insult the viewer.
Right. Yeah.
You are not ready. You are not ready for what we're about to, or
Mhm.
are you ready? Okay, come
Yes.
on. Like, or it'd be like loading up a Super Nintendo into a shot put,
Yes.
launcher
Yes.
and launching it and saying that it wasn't worth waiting for,
Yes.
like, because of course back then you were waiting. A lot of folks were waiting for the
For
Ultra
the yeah.
64, like they knew PlayStation was great. They could see it,
Do you remember there was this one ad that Sony ran? If you still want a Saturn, then your head is in Uranus. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yes, I do. And of course, Sega, they're not innocent. They threw a PlayStation off of a 10-story building and said, prepare to fly.
Yes.
Plaything or
Yes.
whatever, they called it
Yeah.
Plaything, and 3DO, 3DO, they called all the other consoles toys. They threw a Sega Genesis and a Super Nintendo into a toy box, just kind of like unceremoniously chucked them into a toy box and then slammed the lid and it said toys. So that's just how you marketed consoles back then, not by their own merits per se. They might spend like several $1 million on an ad that hardly even shows any actual gameplay at
Right.
all. Instead it's just like, here's the way that you feel when you're playing our console. You feel like your face is like your skin is melting off of your
Right.
face.
100%.
Like was it Magnavox? I forget who it was. Their icon was like a dude in a chair being like kind of like thrown back, from the audio or
Okay.
whatever.
Yeah.
And there was an ad like that where it was like there was a kid on the couch, and his just the extremeness of the Sega CD was just pushing him back into his chair and like pinning him to the wall, and he's like, Sega, you know.
So Sony seemed to kind of inherit the edgy advertising from the fourth generation. They continued it to the fifth. Whereas Sega, when the
Hmm.
Saturn came out here, theirs were a lot weirder. Like, I mean, the theater of the eye and,
Oh, right.
the head for Saturn ad campaign, like that was less edgy and maybe more artsy. Although, I mean, I guess with the
Right.
adrenaline coming and beating up the rods and cones that were watching things in the theater of the eye.
Right.
What I mean, like it was, and then Nintendo, when they came out, they were actually a lot more like they were not nearly as edgy. It was like, on September 30th, dinosaurs will fly, and like it was all about like they showcased their games a little bit more so, and stayed away from that.
Yeah, Nintendo, classic, conservative company in their
Yeah,
nature,
yeah,
refused to play that game.
yeah.
They're like, we're just gonna show good, wholesome, fun
Hmm.
gameplay
Hmm. Hmm.
experiences. You know what I'm saying? So you could say that they're kind of, innocent from that. They didn't really partake in that.
Not in the
May oh,
fifth generation. Yeah,
not in the fifth generation. Before that, when you're playing with Nintendo, you're playing with power, and they would definitely kind of push back because you could tell they were tired of
yeah.
having to deal with all these insults. Um, but yeah, they never really did the same kind of like just low down and dirty mudslinging that everybody else did.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, there was a lot of smoke and mirrors back then. I have to say, like, there was always the difference between reality, like actual gameplay reality, and what they would push in an ad. Because
Yes,
a lot of
yes.
times the fact is they were still trying to figure out how to make these games, what these games were supposed to be.
Hmm.
Some of these gaming experiences were not fully realized, were not fully fleshed out. And the truth is, they'd get these things over to marketing, and marketing would be like, how do we sell this? This is actually a really crappy game. Like, how do we sell this? Well, let's just not show a whole lot of the game. Let's just show, depictions of how you might feel if you're playing this game. So, and again, without the internet or without any kind of like quick review that you can look up and stuff like that, these
What did you
advertisements
know?
could be
Yeah.
very persuasive, in terms of like a kid asking their parents what they want for Christmas. They're like, oh, this looks amazing
Yes.
on this commercial.
You know, and one great example of that was the Choice Cuts demo disc that was initially packaged with Saturns. So there was no gameplay on that disc at all. It was a demo
Hmm.
disc that featured like, I don't know, 15 different titles, but none of them were playable. It was all video
Hmm.
clips. So first of all, the video was grainy because it was compressed. It was not, drawn using any in-game graphics engine or anything. It was just recorded FMV footage. And I remember one of the games that was on this disc is Myst. And so you think about a game like Myst. I mean, it's essentially a slideshow. So how do you demo that and make it
Right.
exciting? So the way it was done on the Sega, I mean, they pumped some like hardcore, guitar music, and they showed as many clips as probably were available in the entire Myst game of any kind of animation or whatever. So that as you're watching this, you're thinking, "Yeah, I want Myst because it's just so cool," and you know what I
Right.
mean? Where but the product was exactly not that. So
They try to like, we need to make this look like more action.
yeah, definitely, And if you think about the games that were on there, I mean, even so, Pebble Beach Golf Links or Blackfire, games that, Pebble Beach would be sort of like a relaxing kind of golf sim. You wouldn't want it to be pumping hardcore rock music in the back, but that's exactly what this demo disc was. So,
Right.
it just, yeah, I mean, again, it was a time where everyone was kind of figuring out what worked and what didn't. So,
Hmm.
it was what it was, and it's fun to look back at, but during the time, you're right, there was a lot of confusion too. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah, Mist is cool, let's get Mist, like, whereas when you eventually got it, maybe it didn't quite live up to those sort of, heart pounding expectations you may have had. So
Hmm. Isn't that crazy? Like, when you finally get your hands on these things, when you finally see them, then word starts spreading. People start
mhm,
talking, and they saying, wow, I just played a PlayStation for the first time. Looks really good. Like, people said that Sony couldn't do video games, but like, and the name is kind of funny sounding, PlayStation, you know. I'm saying that from personal experience. Now it's
it's
like
a word.
Kleenex to tissue. Like we say PlayStation and it's like second nature, but back then PlayStation sounded stupid.
Yes.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
be honest with you.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I remember thinking that as a kid. I was like, it's a station that you play on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. Genesis sounds so
Yeah.
cool, like, you know, so anyway, you saw the proof was in the pudding,
Mhm.
right? It's a coin of phrase. And so the thing is, Sega, it's funny because they did this earlier on, before Saturn and everything like that with the Genesis. They spent a good deal of money basically renting out a space in a retail store, a couple of these, I believe, and just putting a ton of Genesci with CRTs, hooked up so that people could just come and play it, and experience it for themselves, right?
Yeah.
Let the games speak for themselves, right? And it was actually like a pretty cool campaign. It was kind of like a test market thing they were doing in like this one city. I read about this in the Rise and Fall of Sega. And so it was a really cool idea, and it actually was quite successful, and it got them a lot of like goodwill, and also got a lot of word of mouth and people buying Sega Genesis, buying into it because they were able to actually like play it with their own hands, see it with their own eyes. And then, they turn around and same CEO, of course, Tom Kalinske, signs off on this like $30 million ad campaign, Theater of the Eye.
Mm-hmm.
$30 million adjusted for inflation,
Ton of cash.
95 to now. $30 million. I can't even imagine how much that could have done, like how much you could have done from a marketing standpoint with $30 million. That ad was I love it. Okay. I love it. Like, I don't deny that it's so crazy, so weird, so cringy, and that I'm glad that it exists. Okay. Just from, because here we are, hindsight. But darn it, if they couldn't have spent that $30 million much better, and they literally could have just bought a bunch of Saturns and put them in kiosks across the United States in malls and stuff like that, and let people play them early,
Yep.
I think that would have done more to spread the word and get the excitement out that Saturn was coming and that you needed to buy one day one, but instead they had
Mm-hmm.
this crazy, and again, it's just such a harebrained idea. Like, I cannot believe that that's how they spent their advertising dollars. And then on top of that, to launch the console early,
Oh
it's
yeah.
just like blunder after blunder. But yeah.
So, what do you think? I mean, like, I want to talk about what each console, what sort of personality, and what sort of, I guess, attitude it wrapped itself around. But before we get there, what do you think are some of the things that changed by the end of the generation?
Well, by the end of the generation, Sega was dormant. I mean,
Yeah, well, it's true.
they bowed out in early '98. And so it was basically a 2-horse race. All the other players had bowed out as well.
Mm-hmm.
You had Microsoft on the horizon, kind of getting interested in games and stuff like that, and creating direct decks and stuff like that, on PCs. But you essentially had Nintendo and Sony going at it, and really Sony just coming out completely dominant. And that's why I would say by the end of the generation, you had Sony firmly established as the number one,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
going from zero to complete hero, and establishing themselves as a force to be reckoned with. And then at the same time, really changing the way that the industry would make games going forward, in a way that couldn't be ignored by other studios, by other game companies. They
Right.
had to follow in Sony's steps because they realized, like, Sony has touched on a formula that is proving to be massively successful, and it's blowing this industry up like big time. So that's what I would say, is that generation, the video game industry saw seismic growth due to Sony. Developing games became much easier because they made it so. They knew, and I've said this before, they knew that they had an uphill battle. They knew that a lot of people were kind of betting against them because they just thought that they were like a hi-fi company, or a
Yep.
Walkman company. And so it's like they did everything they possibly could to make it a success and make the development of games easy and simple, straightforward, so that they could get a lot of third parties on board.
Yeah.
Relatively affordable to publish for. Relatively
Yeah.
not the cheapest, but definitely not the most expensive. great support as a developer or publisher. You weren't necessarily even concerned that it was a little more expensive because the platform was phenomenally successful. So you knew you were going to make your money back in numbers, just in bulk, because you were going to ship a lot of units. So even if you paid more to publish on the PlayStation, you were going to make your money back versus, publishing on a cheaper console, but not moving that many units. So yeah, I mean, it just so I feel like it definitely turned the video game industry into a more grown up one as well.
Yeah.
Like and brought adults into that living room gaming space. Which had pretty much just been dominated by kids in the previous generation.
At the beginning of the generation, and as I guess the generation went on, we had easily a dozen companies throwing a dozen consoles into the ring. And, as the dust settled, it really kind of settled on Nintendo 64 and PlayStation with the Saturn, potentially in that mix, I guess, if you're looking at it from a Japanese perspective. But we would never again see that kind of variety happen. Yes, Microsoft joined in the sixth generation, but, so many of the sort of smaller players, just that was it. That it was make it or break it in the fifth generation. Sony made it, and they reshaped the industry. It's, to be, like you said, a lot more grown up, a lot more of a business focused sort of enterprise. And with that standardization and growth too. I mean, arguably growth in the video game industry was a good thing, but again, the bigger you get, the more considerations and constraints you have to work with. And so that does stifle, artistic expression, creativity to some extent, and what have you. And I think that what happened in the fifth generation continues to shape and inform video games today. The fifth
Right.
generation was really sort of very, very formative. This is where a lot of trends either started or the seeds of which, could be traced back to generation 5. So to me, it was the most consequential generation of games that we have had to date.
It felt a lot like the indie game generation, like so
Mhm.
fifth generation games feel very much indie at times,
Yep.
and that's kind of the equivalent that we have nowadays, and Sony really did help to bring that back, on platforms like the late PS3, but PS4, PS5, they really have tried to welcome in a lot of indie developers. And so that's where you get most of the creativity and the risk taking, which
Mhm,
is with
mhm.
like indie developers who are admittedly moving a lot less units. They're, paying to publish on an extremely popular console, probably not making as much money, but they're smaller teams, of course, And again, the games don't get nearly as much notoriety, as much attention as the big, major games that are coming out on that console. But if folks do kind of dip their toe into the indie side of things, they'll find a lot of unique gameplay experiences that kind of harken back to the late fourth and fifth generation of gaming,
Mhm,
I
mhm.
mean, like stuff like Knights, where it's just like bonkers, off the wall, different. And you just wonder like how we even got that, how we got it was you had these teams of creative people who were just given a blank check to do what they wanted to do is what it
Yep,
basically boils down to.
yep.
There was that kind of trust where, if they had hit a home run before, these Japanese companies, like Sega, would say, okay, this guy's a rock star. We're going to let him run free. We're going to let him do what he wants to do because he's proven himself. We believe, and wouldn't always end up being a success, and
Mhm.
eventually they would see less and less creative freedom if they weren't able to continually hit that ball out of the park. But like folks like Miyamoto, I don't know, he was constantly, I would say, given plenty of freedom to do whatever he wanted to because
Mhm, mhm,
he was just had that god status.
mhm.
So we were able to see projects like F-Zero or Star Fox or whatever. I mean, arguably Star Fox is Argonaut, but I mean, he was able to give it that Nintendo flair and stuff like that and make sure that it actually got made, because he had an idea and they were like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, what you're doing. So I
Yep.
often wonder, without him behind it, if Star Fox would have come, because would they have been like, you want to make a 3D polygonal game that runs at 12 frames per second,
Oh,
you know,
you know,
and it's going to cost $80 to consumers because of
oh,
this extra chip we have to put on it. Like if Miyamoto hadn't been behind that somehow, like I don't know that Nintendo, being as conservative as they are, would have signed off on that, you
yeah,
know?
oh, yeah, and that's such a good point. Like game prices, like one thing Nintendo got away with was by ditching the CD format with the N64, they were able to sell the base unit at a lower cost than initially the Saturn and PlayStation came out. Now Sony did of course go lower and they matched and this and that, and Sega did too, and although that really hurt them. But the downside to that is a lot of N64 carts were just expensive. I recall one Christmas going into a Radio Shack or whatever it was, and there was they were selling new copies of Mortal Kombat Trilogy for the N64,
Hmm.
and they had priced them at $119.99. Now, okay, I'm in Canada, so yes, you have to do the conversion down a little bit for
Yeah,
US dollars back then, but let's convert it down to say 100 US bucks.
sure.
$100 in the mid 90s for one cartridge, like that is
Was
insane.
ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. And so that was sort of the downside to the cartridge medium. But, again, cartridge medium on the N64 with 4 control ports, like a really arcade heritage
Right.
offering from Sega with the Saturn, and then the sort of mainstream polygonal, easy to program and easy to get into PlayStation. So all three of those sort of front runners of that generation had their own personalities in a way.
Yeah. I mean, without a doubt, though, that decision to go cartridges was what put Nintendo behind
Oh, for sure.
PlayStation,
For sure.
without a doubt. Because I mean, flash memory is so cheap now, but back then it was so expensive.
Yes.
So expensive. Like every time you wanted to expand the scope of a game or something like that, you had to get double the size of chip on there. And those were really expensive to put those. And you had a PCB, and you had whatever extra chips they might throw on there, which they did later on. The N64 is like each one of those carts. Yes, you got control. Nintendo was able to keep their control. They were able to kind of like, I guess you could say, arguably maintain control over piracy. But then, of course, not even, because there were like things like the Bung Doctor 64 or whatever. People were able to rip Nintendo 64 cartridges even all the way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Rip them to zip disk or whatever. But essentially, yeah. If you wanted to release a game like Resident Evil 2, which it seemed like it was such a huge game, you were nobody if you didn't have it on your system. So it was like, we have to do this, guy. We have to publish it. Capcom has given us permission. How can we not publish this game? It's huge, right? So they have to take a bath basically because each one of those carts, it's like one of the biggest games, to cram in all that FMV and stuff like that.
Yep.
It must have cost them a fortune to create each one of those, and I'm sure they didn't make any money on it. I wonder if they did, because of what it cost them to manufacture. But yeah, so Nintendo 64 from a hardware standpoint, from what it actually put on screen was pretty solid, and it's just incredibly limited by the format,
Yes.
of cartridges.
Definitely, yes. No, you're right. I mean, it's easy to look back on all this stuff in retrospect, and you could say, okay, well, the Nintendo 64 has no sound chip, and so any music that it generates is all done through software, and it will never match CD quality, and that is all true. But at the time, one of the first Nintendo 64 games I ever bought myself was Ocarina of Time, and that just blew me away, despite the fact that it didn't have a CD soundtrack. So, it's like you mentioned earlier with Team Andromeda, teams were able to take what they had and work with it and do the best that they could with it. And in some cases, they had phenomenal results. Um,
Right.
the game that ultimately made me buy a PlayStation back in the day was Final Fantasy VII. I
Oh,
did,
I thought it was Tomb Raider.
um, or no, I'm sorry, maybe it was Tomb Raider. I ended up getting Tomb Raider 2 as well as Final Fantasy VII very close to each other. So maybe you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe actually, yeah, I think it was Tomb Raider. I needed to play Tomb Raider 2. Wasn't really all that impressed with Tomb Raider 2.
Right.
compared to the
I
original.
remember that.
Final
Yeah.
Fantasy VII had so much hype around it, and I was definitely an RPG guy, so I had to
Yeah.
play it. And so I played it, and it was good. It was okay. And I did end up getting Final Fantasy VIII when it came out, and I was not a fan, not at all. I did not
Mm.
finish the game. I got maybe 20 hours in. I was like, you know what? This sucks. I don't like this game. And now looking back at Final Fantasy VII, it to me, and this may be a hot take, but it was okay. It was okay. It wasn't that super awesome. I thought it kind of dragged in
Mm.
some places, and some of the animations for some of the summons, it was just like, okay, I guess I have time to go get a snack because they're just going to play out for so long. It's just that kind of stuff. But again, it was still very much, we're all trying to figure out what works and what doesn't in a video game. So Sony and Nintendo were by no means infallible to that. Like, they made some really weird decisions. I mean, the Trident controller is one of the I hate it. I hate it tremendously. I hate the analog stick on it. I don't like the fact that it's got the three prongs. Sony's first controller I thought was a piece of garbage too. When by the time they moved to the DualShock, that was better. We're okay now. We've got
Mm.
a couple of analog sticks on there, but initially I wasn't a fan either. So yeah, so definitely even the big companies would be trying a lot of things that maybe initially didn't really work out so great. I mean, I don't know. What did you think? Do you think that Sony and Nintendo, for the most part, got things very, very right? I mean, obviously the market seems to have thought so, because they got,
Sony got the most things right, I guess.
yeah, that's true.
Why they came out on top, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I always saw Nintendo 64 as the party console. Like the
Mm,
one thing they really got right was they put 4 controller ports right on the front of the console.
yep,
Didn't have to buy some kind of extra peripheral, which was going to be another ask to your parents, or
yep,
you're going to have to save up. You get it, you had it out the box. So, instead you could ask your parents, instead of getting an extra peripheral, you could ask them for an extra controller, so it's
yep.
very much a communal, fun living room system where you could have multiple people play. And they built games around that, like Star Fox, with, 4 ships that you could fly, or GoldenEye, or
Mario Kart,
Mario Party,
Mario
or
Party, yeah,
Mario Kart, many, many, many fun multiplayer experiences that would attract a lot of people at like game nights, or like I would go to like a high school lock-in where they had a PlayStation hooked up, but nobody was playing it because everybody wanted to play GoldenEye. Everybody
hmm,
wanted to like hop in and take turns. Like if somebody went down, then it was someone else would hop on, and I was just like, it attracted huge crowds for Star Fox 64 and GoldenEye because again, it had that, it had that kind of communal play, which was tougher on PlayStation. With PlayStation was a really great console for like solitary gaming experiences. I feel, yeah, it had some, multiplayer stuff going on, but for the most part, it was like a really good grindy console
hmm,
experience where you just kind of are grinding through Gran Turismo yourself, and earning the different licenses and getting more cars, or you're grinding through some RPG, like Final Fantasy VII or whatnot. I really was impressed with Final Fantasy VII. The only misgiving I had was that the characters were like really, really blocky,
yeah,
and we were coming from Final Fantasy VI on the SNES, which had beautiful pixel art,
yep.
to that, and I was just like, why does Cloud have like these stubby nubs for arms, but be that as it may, they were quickly able to wrangle that console and push much more fidelity out of it. By like Final Fantasy IX, the characters looked much more, detailed and artistic and something. And I absolutely love Final Fantasy IX. One of my
Mm,
favorite Final Fantasy games. Yeah, no, I think that the PlayStation ended up being more like the adult's console. I feel like the PlayStation, because I mean, my dad was an adult and he just absolutely loved the thing, took it with him everywhere. You had games like Medal of Honor. You had more adult games like either they were like mature rated games, or they were just games that were of a subject matter that was going to be interesting to adults, like Metal Gear Solid, and you had
hmm,
stuff like with the Cold War and stuff like that. It's like a lot
hmm,
of kids didn't even know what the Cold War was, but you
right.
had you had these games with edgy graphics, edgy characters, lots of cigarette smoking, and adult themes, and of course teens dug it, thought it was great, but also adults could get into it and say, okay, I don't don't feel silly playing Metal Gear Solid, because it seems like a very adult game, And yeah, so I feel like Saturn ended up just being like this quirky, you called it an also ran, which I think is apt, as much as we love it, like I'm just being realistic about it. It's not the console that you felt like you had to have back then if you were part of the general public. It was the console that either you were a diehard arcade gamer and you needed to have those kind of experiences at home, or you were really into the art of 2D pixel gaming, which was totally not in vogue at that time,
Yeah.
sadly to
Yeah.
say, So it was like, if you knew, you knew. If you really wanted Saturn, you sought it out and you got it. Or you just happened to be that kid whose parent got it because they were familiar with the Sega name, and then you regretted it and tried to trade it in for a
Yeah. Yeah.
PlayStation or a Nintendo 64, because that's not what you were there for. You were there for like these blockbuster, more mainstream games, and you didn't get that on Saturn, arguably. So you sought out those louder consoles, But again, like, I wanted a Saturn. I specifically got it, and I knew what I was getting myself into, and I enjoyed it every bit.
So let me, you know what? Okay, so I just had a thought here, and I'm going to kind of articulate it, and you
Okay.
tell me what you think. So I love how you called the Nintendo 64 a communal gaming system, like a party night type of system. I think that's super apt. And I would agree. Yeah, the PlayStation was like that sort of mainstream blockbuster, however solitary sort of machine that was the go-to for those experiences. Um, and I'd always sort of quantified the Saturn as more of like an arcade type system where you're going to get the arcade conversions to come to the home.
Mm-hmm.
However, of course, at the beginning of the generation, the arcades were like light years ahead of what the Genesis and the Super NES could do. But by the end of the generation, that gap wasn't nearly as big anymore. It was
Right.
still there, but
Mm-hmm.
suddenly the PlayStation, the N64, and the Saturn arguably could do things that were advanced enough that you had a relatively similar experience than you could at the arcades. The arcades were still further ahead, but by that time they weren't as far ahead, and they were starting to fade away
Right.
from popularity, right? And so the Saturn, I think, would have been an amazing system at the true beginning of the fifth generation. But as
Right.
the generation progressed, everything about the Saturn, all of its strengths and everything that it stood for, was really falling out of vogue, you know? And so it's like it was the wrong system for the wrong time, if that makes sense. Like, to me, if the Nintendo 64 is a bowl of pretzels, and the PlayStation is your McDonald's burger, then the Saturn was like the fine dining that not everyone would really want and appreciate, and or even be able to afford, for that matter. And you never really got quite enough on your plate. You know what I mean?
Right.
Some of the best games were locked in Japan and never made it over. It sort of faded away along with the arcade scene, and it just kind of it was an also ran that, in retrospect, when you're not constrained by the time that you're living in, it's a fantastic machine, and that's why we all love it.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the wrong console for the wrong time. Everything changed as the Saturn was coming out, and it suddenly looked like it just wasn't even ready for what it needed to be. I mean, was that fair? Would you agree with any of that? Would you add to that?
I mean, yeah, I would definitely agree with all of that. I definitely think that we never really saw what the Saturn was fully capable of from a graphic
Uh,
standpoint.
yeah.
But even having said that, I don't think that it ever would have eclipsed the way PlayStation draws graphics. Like, PlayStation does a really good job. Like, it's very smooth with the alpha transparencies, the Gorad shading, and some of the lighting effects that you get on PlayStation, and just the way that it draws 3D polygons. It produces stuff like Gran Turismo 2, which I look at that and I say, it's hard for me to believe that that would be completely possible on the Saturn.
Hmm.
Um, we've seen some amazing things from the community, from the homebrew community, and but again, I still feel like the Saturn is kind of held back by a few little bottlenecks, by a few, I guess, points of contention in its design that make it difficult to say that it would have eclipsed PlayStation head to head, just doing 3D polygonal games. But there's no contest when it comes to 2D 2D sprite or hand-drawn graphics. You got stuff like the Island of Seven Winds
Yep.
game, which
Yep.
is like amazing, like large hand-drawn sprites that are moving fluidly. And you never would have gotten anything like that on the Saturn. Of course we didn't, or sorry, on the
Yeah.
PlayStation.
Yeah.
And we didn't get it in the West anyway. So, for what it's worth. But again, I feel like Sega and the Saturn was really looking not at Sony, when it was developed. It was looking at the players like Atari with the Jaguar
Yep.
and
That's fair.
3DO. And those were the consoles to beat. And did it do it? Yes, I do. Definitely. It beat those consoles quite handily. And it didn't really count on Sony being the absolute phenomenal success that it was. And that is guaranteed for sure. Like Sega just did not see Sony coming, or at least they did not take that threat seriously like they should have until it was way too late,
Mm-hmm.
And, Sony really did just double down on 3D. They said,
Yep.
Sega's doing it in the arcades. It looks phenomenal. Everyone loves it. Nintendo's playing around with it, has been playing around with it with the Super FX stuff, and they're going to be coming out with a 3D machine. We got to go all in on 3D. 2D is old and out of vogue. Let's just, go full force 3D gaming all the way, and let's do it as well as we possibly can. And let's make it easy to do. Let's make it, because nobody really knows how to make a 3D game. So let's make it as easy as possible to kind of make these games in this sandbox that we create, for them with these development tools. And we'll court a bunch of third-party developers, and we might even steal some from Sega, or steal some from Nintendo,
Mm-hmm.
which they totally did, So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, what can I say? I always like to take things on their own merits, and just look at them for what they are. But also context is very important, And if you look at the Saturn in terms of that early, 94, 95, 96, that's the period at which it was most competitive and most compelling,
Yeah. Yeah.
And then as you get into 97, 98, 99, it's PlayStation all the way. They ran away with it
Yeah.
and just left everybody in their dust.
And that's so true. And so it's funny because Sony was able to dial into what the gamers wanted with the 3D, at least here in the West. And that's why the Saturn, I think had such a struggle with it, is because their focus wasn't on what Sony was doing or what the Western gamer may have wanted at the time. They stuck to the arcade conversions and this and that. And so everything that would have worked for them splendidly at the beginning of the generation was falling out of vogue by the end of the generation. But then you look at in Japan, where the Saturn had a lot more success. They were incredibly dialed into the gaming culture. There were a lot of games that were based on very popular animes that were running in Japan. There were a lot of visual novels, and those were really kind of
dating simulator,
you name it, absolutely.
Stuff,
and so it's funny because same company, same machine, same platform, same console, very, very dialed into what
they knew their market
needed in Japan, and completely out of vogue in the North market. You know what I mean? So it's just funny how that worked out. And, but that's as much on Sega themselves as it is on Sony running a brilliant, business plan. And I often wonder, like, Sony has become so big in the gaming industry that it would be inconceivable for somebody to knock them completely out. I don't mean, completely possible that on any given generation, Nintendo might somewhat outsell them or whatever, but no one's going to knock Sony out anymore. But they could have in the fifth generation. That's when Sony was the newcomer, and they could have been an also ran. But they played their cards brilliantly, and I would argue that Sega obviously had their own sort of self-inflicted wounds, but Nintendo to an extent did too. Not nearly as catastrophic as Sega, but Nintendo did as well. And so out of that, sort of rubble came out this giant beast named Sony, and now they are this juggernaut that's more or less unstoppable. So yeah, another consequential sort of outcome from the fifth generation was the rise of Sony.
They're like synonymous with video games to an extent. And, just the shift of the video game industry to a much more controlled standards, a much larger industry, larger projects, much more oversight, and a lot less gets through, at least in terms of what the big publishers will put out, and you do get a lot of homogenized gaming experience is. You get a lot of repeat stuff, and you get a lot of stuff that kind of errs on the side of safety,
Yes.
rather than
Yeah.
creativity, with a few exceptions. Of course, there's always a few exceptions. Of course, you get large directors, who are given more credence because they've proven themselves, so they're able to kind of like run free. Stuff like Shadow of the Colossus, that kind of, and the later games that they put out. And you have companies like Quantic Dream making games, like Heavy Rain or what, and you get artistic stuff to an extent, but again, most of the bigger stuff is a little on the safe side, I would say.
Hmm.
And then the exceptions or the outliers are really going to be, if you want creativity, you're going to look more to like the indie
Of course.
scene, which is supported on a lot of the larger consoles, which is a good thing, so you at least get indie developers able to publish games and, continue to publish great games, as long as they can sell enough, they can make a living,
Yeah.
they can continue to do it. But we didn't really even talk that much about, and we're running up on time, so we don't really have time, but we didn't really talk that much about Neo Geo CD
Yeah.
or, 3DO even that much, or Atari Jaguar. I mean, it was very clear very quickly and early on that they just weren't going to come out on top.
Mhm.
Once you actually started seeing their competition, what they could do versus what they said they could do in ads, and then what the other players were actually doing. When you'd walk into a game store and pick up a controller, you'd quickly see the difference. But yeah, so during this time, it was crazy. There were so many different players on the field, and at one time, you literally had 32X. You had Philips CDI, you had Neo Geo CD, you had 3DO,
Mhm.
Atari Jaguar, Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, PlayStation. It's ridiculous, right?
Mhm.
And
Yep.
obviously, all of these can't possibly compete and exist, harmoniously on the same market. There's just not enough interest or dollars to go around. So
Yeah.
it really was like a land rush, or I guess you could say a games rush to kind of see who was going to come out. And yeah, it was an exciting time to be a video game fan. And had I been an adult, I might look back on it a little differently, or maybe I'd have had more awareness of everything that was going on like I do nowadays. But again, I have very specific memories based on the fact that I was like a young teen during that time.
Yeah. Yep. And it was a good time to be a gamer. Like, despite the fact that there was so few rules and that you really had to take a chance on this, that, or the other. It was exciting. It was fun. It's a time that I look back at very fondly. I'm obviously glad I picked the Saturn as my horse. I love it to
Yeah.
this day tremendously. But I did
Hmm.
also at the time own a PlayStation and a Nintendo 64, and I did have good experiences on those consoles as well. So, not to take away from their contributions or even the contributions of the smaller players that bowed out fairly quickly. So it was exciting, it
Absolutely.
was fun, and it was a paradigm that I think, coupled with the arcade scene and the lack of an internet for folks in
Hmm.
internet communities, I think it's a time that can never come again. And so, it was very special to live through that for sure.
Absolutely. And I too, like, I do love all three systems. I've made a lot of jokes in the past about N64 because arguably there are less games that I'm interested in on that console than like say on Saturn or PlayStation, but still, like, there's several handfuls of good games on the Nintendo 64 that I will go back to, it's just, and I love the PlayStation too. It's just, as content creators and stuff, we really only have enough time to really focus heavily on
Hmm.
one machine, and of course that's going to be the one that I've love heart and soul, and that's the Saturn. But I do really love and appreciate the PlayStation. It is a quite a great machine with lots of good software on it, for sure.
Yep.
You might even argue there's more good games on the PlayStation. I don't know, because it had so many games, that if you like did a side by side comparison of good games, you might find more software on the PlayStation. That I don't care. The Saturn is still my number one, for sure. And it
Hmm.
just because of the kind of games that it has and the character of the games that it has, it's a very specific style of gaming, and I guess that makes us the weird ones, right? Because we're definitely the outliers. uh Yeah,
for sure.
definitely. Oh, you're no doubt in a room full of people, you're going to get more hands up that they have more nostalgia for the PlayStation than the Saturn. There's just,
Oh
we
yeah.
have to band together because there's not as many of us, but we do exist.
We do exist, and we continue to enjoy the Saturn to this day. And
Absolutely.
and at least for me, it continues to be my favorite system, of course,
Hmm.
and zero regrets. Zero regrets.
And I wholeheartedly recommend folks, if you want to get a good picture of what it was like in the game industry back then, check out Next Generation magazine.
Hmm.
Honestly, you could also do well to look at some game fan issues, from definitely from a more consumer and gamer perspective, but also Next Generation just did a really good job of kind of showing the different movements, the plays as they were happening, and interviewing, different developers and interviewing publishers and CEOs, and you get to hear these CEOs talk about how hopeful they are, and oh yeah, we're going to pull through. It's going to be totally fine. And then by the next year, or by the
Yeah.
next few issues, it's like, okay, yeah, they're completely dead in the water. So I mean, I really recommend. I believe there is an archive on Internet Archive or out of print archive, of Next Generation magazine, and it's definitely a go-to for game history, because it just at the time did such a good job of representing all of the movements that were going on in the games industry.
Yeah, I'll second that. What a great snapshot of the era. Definitely, that magazine did a good job because they were
And if
more
you're in the UK, it would be Edge, I
edge. Yep.
believe. You would look at not completely the same magazine, but they used a lot of the same. They shared a lot of the same articles and features and stuff like that. And so it would be a good one to look at if you're in the UK or in Europe, is Edge magazine. But yeah, I think that's about it for us though for today. We got to wrap it up. But anything else you want to just say about the fifth generation before we close?
Oh, you know what? Nothing that we haven't already said, other than, again, this was such a magical time to live through, and it's something that it all kind of came about due to circumstance, and it could never sort of happen again. So I'm just really glad to have lived through it as a
Mm-hmm.
teen and experienced it firsthand, because it was really fantastic.
Right. Like the Great Depression or something like that. It's a period in history that, okay, that might be a little melodramatic, but it's definitely a period in gaming history that is, it was wild, and like you said, I don't think it'll ever happen again. Not like that,
Yeah.
uh, just because of all the extenuating circumstances. But yeah, so until next time, this is Saturn Dave and Peter reminding you to play your Sega Saturns and or your other fifth generation consoles of choice. It's okay. Just don't play them too much. Play the Saturn more,
Saturns, yeah,
right?
that's it. Sounds good. All right,
you
take
you
care,
you
everybody.
have to play the Sega Saturn. We're not going to force you to play any of those other games, but we'll definitely come to your house and break your legs if you don't play the Saturn. But until next time, this is Saturn Dave and Peter signing out.